When the narcissist finally knew you'd never come back, the moment you stopped explaining yourself was the moment they felt powerless. There was a time when every misunderstanding shattered your peace. You wanted to be understood so badly that you twisted yourself in knots, trying to justify your heart to someone who didn't even care about the truth. Every word you spoke, every explanation you gave, became fuel for them to manipulate you even deeper. You thought clarity would save the relationship, but all it did was feed their control. You kept believing that if you just said it better, they'd finally get it. That if you just remained calm, if you showed compassion, they'd see the real you. But what you didn't see back then was that they already saw you. They just didn't value you. They heard your cries, your pleas, your reasons, and they chose to twist them anyway. Explaining became a trap. Every time you opened your mouth to speak your truth, they spun it into a new narrative. You were too emotional, too sensitive, overreacting. They made you doubt your own reality, and in that doubt, they thrived. You began to question whether maybe, just maybe, you were the problem. But then one day, something inside you snapped. Not in pain, but in power. You hit a threshold, a place where the pain of staying silent became more tolerable than the pain of explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. You didn't owe them another sentence. You didn't owe them another drop of your energy. Silence became your revolution. It wasn't passive. It was electric. It was filled with boundaries and backed by self-worth. And that silence did something your words never could. It scared them. Because suddenly, they didn't know what you were thinking, feeling, or planning. They lost their grip on your mind. They started trying harder, texting more, probing you through flying monkeys, social media, and fake check-ins. But you didn't budge. You weren't just silent, you were done. And for someone who lived off your reactions, your disengagement was the loudest roar you could have made. They waited for the old you, the one who couldn't stand unresolved conflict. The one who'd rather be hurt than be misunderstood. But that version of you was gone, buried in the ashes of your last explanation. What remained was someone new, someone they didn't know how to control. You started living again, breathing again. Your silence wasn't empty. It was full of healing. And the narcissist, they sat in confusion, scrambling to figure out where their power went. But it wasn't taken. You just reclaimed what always belonged to you. This shift didn't just affect your relationship with them. It began to transform your entire world. You found peace in places you used to feel chaos. You found clarity in moments you used to drown in doubt. You found a new voice, a quiet, steady, grounded voice inside you that didn't need permission to exist. And that voice kept whispering the truth. You don't need to be explained. You don't need to be validated by someone who built their confidence on your confusion. You don't need to chase understanding from a person who feeds off distortion. The narcissist thought your silence meant you were weak. But silence, when rooted in strength, is more powerful than 1,000 arguments. Because silence means you no longer need the outcome. You've detached, you've let go. They felt it, and they hated it. Because your silence was a wall they couldn't climb, a code they couldn't crack. You are no longer in the game, and when a narcissist realizes their favorite chess piece has walked off the board, they lose control. And control is their oxygen. That's when they knew. That's when they truly knew. Not when you blocked them, not when you said goodbye, but when you stopped explaining. That was the day the spell broke and the power shifted forever. You didn't just walk away. You outgrew the cage they built for you. They didn't just want to own you. They wanted to shrink you. Slowly, subtly, methodically, they clipped your wings while smiling to your face. Every dig disguised as a joke, every compliment followed by a cut, every "I love you" tangled with "you'll never find better." That wasn't love. That was control wrapped in charm. At first you didn't even realize it because the cage wasn't physical. It was emotional, psychological, spiritual. They praised you just enough to keep you hoping, then punished you the moment you shined too bright. And little by little, your world got smaller, your spirit got quieter, your dreams got dimmer. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. You blamed stress, circumstances, miscommunication. You told yourself they didn't mean it, that they were just hurting. But deep down you knew. You knew you were becoming a shadow of who you used to be, and it scared you. Still, you stayed, because you believed in loyalty, because you thought love meant sacrifice, because you had a heart big enough to carry their wounds and your own. But that heart started to crack under the pressure, and with every crack came light and truth. You began to remember who you were before the cage, the vibrant, fierce, alive version of you they tried to erase. And then, one day, you stopped asking for permission to breathe. You stopped waiting for validation to shine. You stopped begging for a key to a cage you could walk out of any time. They didn't think you'd do it. They thought you were too dependent, too broken, too scared. They had no idea they were raising a phoenix. They mistook your patience for weakness, your compassion for fragility, but they underestimated the power of someone who's had enough. You didn't just leave them. You left the version of yourself who tolerated them. You left the guilt, the shame, the confusion. You outgrew the mental cage they spent years building, and you did it with dignity. You didn't slam the door. You didn't burn the bridge. You just walked out with your head high and your soul intact. And when you left, something terrifying happened for them. They realized they could no longer reach you. Their words didn't sting. Their tactics didn't work. Their absence didn't faze you. You were no longer the person who needed them. You were now the person they couldn't access. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you finally started caring about yourself. You chose growth over guilt. You chose healing over history. You chose truth over trauma. And as you stepped into your new life, you didn't just survive, you began to soar. You rediscovered joy. You rebuilt dreams. You reconnected with your own power. And that power radiated in ways they couldn't handle. Because the best revenge is not anger. It's rising. They watched from the shadows, hoping you'd fall, praying you'd crawl back. But you were too far gone, too elevated, too evolved. You weren't the wounded bird anymore. You were the storm. They didn't lose you when you left. They lost you when you outgrew them, when you realized you were never meant to fit inside the cage. When you understood you were born to fly, and once you tasted freedom, there was no going back. Not to them, not to their drama, not to their prison of manipulation. You were done. That's when they knew. Not when you said goodbye, but when they looked up and couldn't even see your silhouette anymore. You had outgrown their reach, their control, their world. They waited for the hoax of the Hoover, but you left no door open. The narcissist always circles back. That's part of their playbook. They disappear, devalue, discard, but they never truly say goodbye. They leave a crack in the door, just enough room for a return. They rely on the illusion that no matter how badly they treat you, you'll still be there when they want you. That's the Hoover, and they know how to dress it up. A message out of nowhere, I miss you. A phone call on your birthday, a fake emergency, even an apology they rehearse to perfection. They know exactly what to say to trigger your empathy. Because the Hoover is never about love, it's about control. But this time it didn't work. You didn't respond. You didn't flinch. You didn't even acknowledge it. You saw through the glitter, through the mask, through the manipulation. Because you weren't the same person they discarded, you had evolved, you had healed, they expected a reaction, they wanted an opening, even a how dare you would have satisfied them, because any attention, positive or negative, feeds them. Silence starves them, and when you didn't respond, that silence was deafening. They felt it in their gut. This wasn't just about no contact, it was about new contact. With your own self-respect. You weren't avoiding them out of fear. You were honoring yourself out of power. You weren't waiting by the phone. You were building a life they were no longer part of. They checked your social media, hoping to find a clue. They asked mutual friends if you were still upset. They even considered creating fake accounts, fake crises, fake vulnerability, but nothing worked because you didn't just close the door. You tore it off the hinges and bricked up the frame. You didn't leave a forwarding address. You didn't keep the old wounds open. You didn't secretly wish they'd change because you finally accepted the truth. They never loved you. They loved how you made them feel. And once you stopped making them feel powerful, you became disposable. But what they didn't count on was your growth. You didn't just survive their discard. You turned it into your awakening. You used the silence to heal. You used the distance to see clearly. And you used the heartbreak to rise. That rise made you unreachable, not physically, but energetically, spiritually, emotionally. The door they used to walk through whenever they pleased no longer existed. They tried to summon the old patterns, the old hooks, the old fears. But they couldn't find a trace of the old you, and that's what haunted them. Not your rage, not your pain, but your indifference, your peace, your freedom. Because once you experience life without their manipulation, you realize how heavy their presence really was. And you'll never carry that weight again. They thought you'd be waiting, but you were moving. They thought you'd be broken, but you were building. They thought they'd suck you back in, but you'd grown roots in self, worth too deep to be uprooted by fake love. The Hoover was their last trick, and when that failed, the illusion shattered. They realized they had no power left, no strings to pull, no back door to sneak through, and in that realization, they tasted something they never thought they'd feel: powerlessness. They can't process the loss, not because they miss your love, but because they miss your supply, your attention, your energy, your willingness to be emotionally available to their abuse. But you're no longer available. You unsubscribed from the madness. That's when they knew, not when you blocked them, not when you ignored their message, but when they realized there was no route back into your life. Not now, not ever. When you chose peace over chaos, they lost their control. The narcissist is addicted to chaos. It's their playground. It's where they shine, where they dominate, where they spin webs of confusion and control. Chaos is their oxygen, and as long as you're in it with them, they win. They train you to live in reaction mode. One moment, you're the love of their life. The next, you're walking on eggshells. You never know which version of them you're going to get. And in that emotional whiplash, they keep you disoriented, off balance, and begging for stability. But one day, you got tired, not angry, tired of the drama, tired of the emotional acrobatics, tired of asking yourself, what did I do wrong this time? And in that tiredness, a deeper longing was born, not for justice, but for peace. And that's where your power ignited, because the moment you chose peace, they lost their weapon. You stopped engaging. You stopped taking the bait. You stopped trying to win a war with someone who created the battlefield just to watch you suffer. At first, they tried harder. They provoked you. They tested you. They poked at your old wounds, but you didn't rise to it. Because you were no longer operating on their frequency, you had upgraded. You weren't looking for closure. You were living in clarity. Peace became your rebellion, not loud, not aggressive, but grounded. Steady, sacred, and the narcissist didn't know what to do with that. Because chaos is what they understand. Peace, that terrifies them, it's foreign, it's powerful, and most importantly, it's uncontrollable. They started unraveling, not because you attacked them, but because you stopped reacting. Your peace made them irrelevant, and irrelevance is a narcissist's worst nightmare. They want to be the center of your universe. But now they weren't even on your radar. You began to glow differently. You looked happier, healthier, freer, and they noticed. But what they couldn't grasp was how you did it without them, because they always believed you'd fall apart without their drama. But you blossomed in their absence. You didn't just find peace, you became peace, and in that state, nothing they said or did could shake you. You stopped explaining, justifying, arguing. You didn't have to. Your silence became your sword. Your calm became your crown. And when they saw they could no longer create storms in your soul, they realized they had no place in your life, no access, no influence, no value. Because your peace exposed their chaos for what it really was, an addiction to pain. You became your own sanctuary. You built a life where chaos had no seat at the table. And the narcissist, who once thrived off the chaos they created, now found themselves locked out of your calm. They tried everything: guilt, shame, rage, seduction. But nothing pierced your peace, because peace isn't passive. Peace is power, and once you tasted it, you refused to trade it for drama ever again. That's when they knew, not when you yelled, not when you cried, but when you smiled with serenity they couldn't touch. That was the day their control died, and your true life began. They didn't expect you to find yourself in the ruins they left behind when they discarded you. They expected devastation. They thought they broke you so badly that you'd never rise again. They imagined you spiraling, begging, lost in grief. That's how the narcissist feeds their ego, by watching your collapse, and for a while it looked like they were right. You cried, you hurt, you doubted everything. You looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. They didn't just break your heart, they shattered your identity, and in those first moments of silence the pain felt unbearable. But something incredible began to happen in the ruins. You didn't stay down. You didn't rot where they left you. Instead, you began to dig, not for revenge, not for them, but for you, for the parts of you they buried under lies and manipulation. Every tear watered a new seed of self-awareness. Every sleepless night became a classroom for growth. You started asking the deeper questions. Not why did they do this, but why did I allow it? And in that shift, your healing began. You learned that their cruelty wasn't about you. It was about their sickness, their emptiness, their fear of true intimacy. You stopped personalizing their abuse, and you started reclaiming your voice. You began to rebuild, not who you were, but who you were meant to become, stronger, wiser, clearer. The ruins became your foundation, the ashes became your soil, and what they thought was your grave became your rebirth. You found therapy, you read books, you found community, you found your faith. You reached deep into the mess and pulled out a masterpiece, not because it was easy, but because your soul refused to stay broken. And with every step, you transformed, you laughed again, you danced again, you dreamed again, you stopped chasing closure, you started choosing you. And that choice became your freedom. They didn't expect that. They thought you'd fall apart and stay there. They thought you needed them. But you discovered the most powerful truth: you never needed them. You just forgot how powerful you were. When they came back to check if you were still in pieces, they didn't find a victim. They found a victor. They found someone with boundaries, with joy, with radiance. They found someone they could no longer manipulate, and that terrified them. Because your strength exposed their weakness, your healing exposed their harm. Your joy reminded them of what they can never feel: real love, real connection, real growth. They tried to minimize it. You've changed, you're cold. But inside, they knew the truth: you didn't just change. You evolved. You became untouchable. That's when they knew. Not when they discarded you, but when they saw that you turned their destruction into your resurrection. That was the moment their illusion died and your legacy began. When you stopped loving them and started loving you, the game was over. There was a time when your world revolved around them. Every thought, every heartbeat, every decision, you filtered it through their moods, their opinions, their validation. Loving them meant betraying yourself over and over again, and you did it because you thought that's what love was supposed to cost. You gave them the best of you. Your patience, your loyalty, your dreams. You tried harder when they pulled away. You softened when they were cruel. You compromised your truth just to keep the peace. Because deep down, you believed that if you just loved them enough, they'd finally choose you. But they never did, not fully, not authentically, because they didn't want a partner. They wanted a mirror, a reflection that made them feel powerful. And as long as you were loving them more than you loved yourself, they had everything they needed. Then something changed. It didn't happen overnight. It came in waves, quiet, undeniable truths rising in your soul. You looked at yourself and realized you were exhausted, not from loving, but from overgiving, from being loyal to someone who was never loyal to your spirit. You realized that your love wasn't being treasured. It was being used. That's when the awakening started. not with rage, not with revenge, but with the sacred decision to come home to yourself, to take your love back from where it was wasted, and give it to the one person who had been starving for it all along, you. That shift, that was seismic. The moment you stopped loving them and started loving you, everything changed. You stopped explaining your worth. You stopped negotiating your value. You stopped hoping for scraps from a heart that was never full to begin with. You stopped chasing. You stopped waiting. You stopped crying over someone who would never understand the depth of your soul, because your tears weren't weakness. They were a signal that your heart was too pure for someone who only knew how to play games. And in that choice to love yourself, you ended the game, the power they had, gone, the control broken, because narcissists can only thrive where self-love is absent. Once you returned to yourself, they were locked out for good. They felt it, that sudden disconnect from your energy, that lack of access to your emotions, that wall they could no longer climb, and they panicked. Not because they lost someone they loved, but because they lost someone they controlled. They'll try to twist the narrative, say you abandoned them, say you changed, but the truth is, you woke up. You stopped sacrificing your peace for someone who made war in your mind. You stopped loving someone who only showed up when it served their ego. And the most beautiful part, you didn't become bitter, you became brilliant. You didn't just walk away, you ascended. You rose into the person you were always meant to be before they tried to reduce you. Your love didn't disappear, it transformed. It became protection, direction, fuel. You started using it to build, to heal, to rise. You gave it to your purpose, your calling, your joy. You no longer needed them to feel complete, because you remembered you were never broken. They lost the version of you who was willing to bleed for their silence, who begged for their time, who twisted themselves into knots to keep a hollow connection alive. That version died the day you chose yourself, and when you looked in the mirror and finally saw your own light. That was the moment the game ended, not for you, for them. Because the greatest revenge against a narcissist is not rage. It's not destruction. It's self-love, it's healing, it's peace. That's when they knew, not because you screamed, not because you blocked them, but because you started shining in a way they couldn't dim anymore. That was the day they lost the game, and you won your freedom. The day you never turned back was the day you took your life back. There's a moment in every survivor's story when everything shifts. Not because the pain stops, but because the pattern breaks. You've just lived through that moment, and that's why this speech isn't about revenge or bitterness or war. It's about rebirth. You didn't just leave a narcissist. You left behind the version of you that tolerated what you never deserved. You didn't just walk away from a person. You walked into a new identity, one that finally recognizes the power, dignity, and fire within your soul. The day they realized you'd never come back wasn't just a turning point for them. It was a resurrection for you. That was the day the old cycle died. That was the day you broke the trauma bond. That was the day you stopped bleeding for someone who never intended to heal with you. You've reclaimed what they tried to steal. Your voice, your confidence, your future. And even if the healing is still messy, even if some nights still ache, make no mistake, you are not who you were when they met you. You are wiser, sharper, louder in your silence, and more dangerous in your peace. The narcissist knows it. They feel the void where your energy used to fill their broken ego. They sense the door is shut, not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself more than the illusion they sold you. You gave them every chance. You stayed longer than you should have. You forgave what most wouldn't. But now you rise, not in anger, but in alignment, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself that you were always enough. The final freedom doesn't come with a goodbye. It comes with a decision, and you've made it. You've chosen you. You've chosen peace. You've chosen purpose over pain, and that choice, it echoes. It ripples into everything you touch now. From this day forward, you're not looking back. You're not reopening closed chapters to see if they've changed. You already know what's back there: pain, manipulation, and a desperate attempt to survive in a prison you've now outgrown. You don't belong in survival anymore. You belong in expansion. You belong in rooms where your soul doesn't shrink, in relationships where your truth doesn't echo back in shame. You were born to thrive, to shine, to lead, and no narcissist has the power to take that away anymore. This isn't just a chapter closed, it's a story rewritten. It's the beginning of the life you were meant to live before they interrupted it with their dysfunction. You didn't just escape them, you unleashed yourself. So walk tall, speak bold, heal fully, and know this: the day they knew you'd never come back was the day your legacy began. And from this moment on, you owe no one your silence, your guilt, or your return. You owe everything to the you who finally chose freedom.